Thanks, everybody. And I think we could be really excited about commercializing geological storage for an hour to keep your stomachs at bay before lunch. So thank you all for kind of sticking with us through the next hour. You know, I think that this panel has really been, foreshadowed multiple times through the day. And to me, it really feels like a changing atmosphere where we're no longer talking about, again, returning CO2 to the ground, Cindy, in a way that's this burden for corporations, but instead there's a real business opportunity for companies who enable this important, part of the CCUS solution. And so Brad highlighted this is the next new business opportunity, and that's really what we're here to discuss today. And kind of our panelists are all thinking about that from different perspectives. And when we size this business opportunity, we're looking potentially at storing up to 2.3 gigatons of CO2 per year, according to the IEA, by 2060. So that is hugely significant. And certainly will require a lot of wells to be drilled, a lot of monitoring to happen, a lot of infrastructure. And so companies who are on the stage and government and states are kind of thinking about how do we enable U.S. companies to be successful in this endeavor. So I will highlight, we're really going to be focused here on saline storage, and that certainly isn't to dismiss enhanced oil recovery and the security of that storage in any way. But if we look at particularly the U.S. context, we've talked a lot about the existing projects. We have the 51 projects that are in some stage of development. The 10 projects in the U.S., of those projects, 9 of them are enhanced oil recovery. So we have a bit more of a demonstrated model as to how we roll out enhanced oil recovery projects, and commercializing geological storage, hopefully, is this new frontier. And again, to that point, to date around the world, 260 million tons of CO2 have already been stored, but the majority of that has been with enhanced oil recovery. So this growth of what are all the pieces of the puzzle that need to be addressed in order to really ramp up saline storage is the gist of our conversation, and we'll certainly hopefully have kind of a dialogue with the audience towards the end of that. So I am actually going to start, and as I introduce the panels, I'll give them kind of a couple minutes to further introduce themselves if they choose, and talk a little bit about what they're doing at their companies. But we're going to start off today with Mary Sullivan from the Department of Energy. So the CarbonSAFE program has really been instrumental in the United States over, well over a decade in terms of looking at what are the natural resources available in the United States to enable saline storage. And so, Mary, I'll kind of give you an opportunity to talk about what's going on in CarbonSAFE, how that's commercializing CO2, but just a little bit of an introduction for Mary. So she is the project manager for the CarbonSAFE program, has been working within the federal government as a project manager for about 5 years. Mary, you want to take it from there?
Is this on? Yeah. Okay, perfect. So my little hole in the ground is the carbon storage program, which is at the National Energy Technology Laboratory under the Fossil Energy Office, which is in headquarters. So the appropriations, they kind of trickle down to us, and we competitively select projects for financial assistance awards with cost sharing. So the carbon storage program itself is about $90 million each year, and I'd say the CarbonSAFE has been the latest, biggest investment in that arena. We've had about $30 million in fiscal year 19 and fiscal year 20 appropriations. So CarbonSAFE started in 2016. The idea, we have capture and we have storage. Eventually, capture is going to get to a certain point where they need to put commercial scale volumes of CO2 in the ground. The partnerships, the regional carbon sequestration partnerships, I'm sure everyone's familiar with, led the way. They came out with best practices. They injected their goal of 10 million metric tons stored in the ground. They paved the way for projects such as Petronova. but there was still a lot of gaps. You're looking at 1 million metric ton injections. So now we're moving more towards 50 million metric tons over 30 years. So we have to get capture, we have to get storage, and they have to come together at some point, and we're kind of getting there. So we started with phase 1 in 2016. And this was a bit new R&D for us, because at this point it's go out there and start looking at some of the non-technical challenges, such as pore space, liability, dealing with Class 6 permits. Well, I guess that's a technical challenge as well. But so phase 1 was kind of pre-feasibility studies. We made up a word. And can you make your scenario work? Can you capture CO2 at a facility, inject it in the ground, and make it a viable business venture? And at the time, there was no 45Q. So if you read through most of the phase 1 reports, you'll probably find out that the answer was no. It's not economical, especially not without EOR. At the same time, we did start 3 phase 2 projects, and we've added an additional 3 phase 2 projects since then. 1 has finished already. But the phase 2 projects, they started looking at the storage complexes themselves. And finally, we're now getting ready to award projects under phase 3. So phase 3 is our first effort in combining the capture with the storage. So there are some pre-feasibility assessments of capture included in detailed site characterization and getting your permit to construct of a Class 6 well. So that's our next ambitious effort. There'll be 3-year projects. Hopefully we'll have something figured out by early April on those.
Great, thank you, Mary. And we cited that we added 10 projects to the core database this year, and of those, 3 of them are really storage projects. And so there are elements of what sources will go into those sinks, but it's the first time we started adding these storage projects to the database, because we really have seen this trend towards the importance of these hubs that will take sources of CO2 from multiple sources, multiple industrial centers, and put them in that one storage sink. And hopefully we can get economies of scale and move much more quickly into enabling sources of CO2 to have an outlet if they want to store and capture and return their CO2 to the ground. So next up, I'm going to ask Mark to talk a little bit about what DTE Energy is doing. And while we have a little bit of a heavy hitter in terms of the Occidental folks here, people may not know as much about DTE. So they actually see a business opportunity in getting into the geological storage space, and this isn't their kind of traditional world, and I'll let Mark explain that a little bit. But with LCFS and 45Q, they believe that the company can make money, earn some tax credits, and have it fit within their overall portfolio of projects. Mark's with the finance team at DTE. He is not a job hopper, it seems. I think you've been there over 20 years, right? And before that, you were at Air Products another 12 years. So he seems to like to stick around. So hopefully he'll stick around in the CCS space.
That is correct. Thank you for that introduction. For those of you that don't know DTE or not familiar with DTE, DTE Energy is the holding company for 2 Detroit-based utilities, Detroit Edison, now called DT Electric, and Michigan, now called DT Gas. In addition to the utilities, we have a number of non-regulated businesses that operate across the United States, 3 in particular, and they all bring their skills to a CCS effort. We've got a trading company that trades electric products, gas products, but also has an LCFS desk and an AB32 desk for California, which is where we're focused. We have a gas storage and pipeline company that operates primarily in the Midwest, East Coast, and now the Southeast. And then we have the segment that I work with, which is called Power Industrial Projects. Within that group, we have a renewable energy business that operates natural gas projects, which is now evolving to renewable natural gas. We have businesses that take waste wood and convert it to renewable power. And actually, both those businesses are primarily in California. We have within that group an industrial energy services group that helps industrials, whether it's cogeneration, wastewater treatment, a variety of kind of utility-esque projects, but we're used to working within our customers' fence lines. And then we have an environmental controls group. And if you think about all those skill sets across the board there, it plays very well into what we think is a great opportunity is CCS focused on industrials. And we are focused initially on California. We think the 45Q on top of the LCFS provides the incentive that we need. And our model is to construct hubs which will attract CO2 from various industrial sources. Some of those sources are ready to bring the CO2 to us today. Others we're working with and will install equipment at their facilities and also do the transportation to our hubs. So we're real excited about that.
I'll go over to Ryan now, who's with Occidental Petroleum. So he is a senior policy advisor there, and before that, he was very involved in the policy scene in DC, working as a fellow in Senator Whitehouse staff. But Ryan, obviously Occidental has made several announcements over the past several years regarding their commitment to the CCS space, what they think of as opportunities for the company to make money doing geological storage, both through enhanced oil recovery and saline storage, as well as, I know you have some utilization projects under your belt as well. How does Occidental kind of think about this space and the revenue opportunities here?
Sure. First, thanks, Patricia, and to the Institute for having us here today. It's great to be here. So, as you said, with the advent of 45Q, we're diving headfirst into all things CCUS, building off the history that Oxy's been doing geological sequestration for 40 years through enhanced oil recovery. But when that was the main financial driver to want to put CO2 underground. But now with policies in the last couple of years, we've got 45Q and also LCFS, as Mark spoke about. Now there's a value proposition to do dedicated sequestration for its own end. And so we see it as a logical next step to move past enhanced oil recovery and also do dedicated sequestration. So in addition to, we're doing kind of two things in this space. Firstly, developing our own projects, our own capture projects, new facilities, taking our own CO2, but also we've set up inside our low carbon ventures division a group that's developing CO2 sequestration services. So this is just services to help other industries deal with their CO2 offtake, and we'll sequester the CO2. We're not necessarily the project developer, the owner of the equipment, etc. And so amongst the announcements we've made in the last year, one was the first agreement under that services division, which is a project in Mississippi being led by Velocys. It's a waste woody biomass fish and troche process turning into jet fuel and diesel, where we'll just partner to take the CO2 and sequester it. So that's kind of what Oxy's doing, and I'd also like to just step back a bit and talk about in general commercializing this space, kind of what we see as the key ingredients to achieve a commercial industry. And there's going to be no surprises here. These are points that have been hit home time and time again already today. First key ingredient obviously is a value on putting CO2 underground. We have 45Q on the LCFS now, but we're going to need to not only keep those, we're going to need to expand them, extend them, have new things like procurement to really drive value to put CO2 underground. Another one that's been hit time and time again already is hubs. We need to develop hubs. Mary's spoken about developing hubs. Mark's trying to develop hubs. The fundamental reason we need hubs is that sequestration has a big economy of scale. The more CO2 you bring to one place, the cheaper it is per ton of CO2. And that's how we get the cost of the CCUS system down. That's how we get big scale deployment. OGCI are working on that. We've heard about the T-Site project, the Northern Lights project. OGCI is also working to help facilitate hubs in America. And then the key enabler of hubs, the key thing that makes a hub work is infrastructure. We've also heard about that already. We need the infrastructure to pull the CO2 and bring it to the locations. We can do it at scale. And we've already heard about the challenges with that and how we're going to need extra policy support to help make that happen. Finally, again, it's been hit time and time again already, so this is really, I don't really need to say this, but building trust is imperative. We need to build these projects, do them well, and show that transparently that we can do it. Again, that goes into the building coalitions, and really that feeds back strongly into point one. If we want the policies to be there, if we want more policies in the future, we have to build trust through the projects we do in the near term. That's it.
Thank you,
The rest of the
Ryan.
team will have an amazing CCS industry very soon.
Next, I'd like to ask Jason to join the conversation. So Jason is the director of the State Energy Office at the state of Louisiana. And, you know, when I listen to kind of Jason talk about it, what I think is really exciting is, you know, they do look at it from multiple perspectives. They want to get down their emissions per capita in the state, but they also want to help Louisiana businesses be as kind of profitable, as forward-thinking, as prepared for the future as possible. And they think CCUS is an important part of that. And so I would say Louisiana has certainly been a leader looking to see how they can help companies within their state to develop CCUS projects, including kind of a variety of state legislation. Jason, you want to talk a little bit about what you're doing there?
Is this on? Thanks so much, Patricia and Jeff, and thanks for hosting. I think it's the most exciting thing for us is any opportunity we have to talk about Louisiana, especially in a global forum, is extremely exciting. So I'm thrilled to be here today and just to tell you a little bit about why we're here and what we're doing. So I do want to structure a little bit of my comments toward the end of them based on some of the challenges that we're seeing with sequestration and some of the things that you can kind of track and help us follow and really get involved in and help on the appropriation side. So in terms of why Louisiana's at the table and why we've taken such a vested interest in this, I think that it's very clear. We're a Gulf Coast state. We live and breathe the coast, and that economy is what drives our state. Oil and gas, the coastal communities, the fishing communities. The problem with those communities is that we're losing them very quickly. I came from the governor's office and worked on coastal for a number of years and managed a very large program that's trying to combat that. So just a couple of stats on that. We're projecting to spend almost $7 billion in the next 15 years based on offshore oil and gas revenues and also revenues from the Deepwater Horizon to try to combat a lot of that land loss that's happening in the coast. So sea level rise is real. You see a lot of big cities like Miami, even in the Gulf Coast and all these other communities that are looking at this and looking long term to see what they can do to combat some of this. So for us, industrial greenhouse gas emissions, I mean, working with our communities to understand resilience, those are big key ticket items that we need to look at. When you look at CO2 emissions in Louisiana, we're fifth in the nation in terms of emitting carbon dioxide for industrial. A lot of our work that we do, we are tremendous at manufacturing products, but we also emit carbon dioxide in the process. So CCUS brings all those different players who are in the state together. And we see it as a technology that has the potential to look at bringing a lot of these things together and actually creating a carbon economy based on those industries. So our dream and what we're trying to do on the sequestration side is to develop these hubs, to look at long-term, how do we bring companies and sources together to partner with pipelines, where storage locations are optimal, how do we get these industries to start thinking about this long-term to where they're doing it on the forefront of investments. We have unprecedented investment in LNG in Louisiana, some of the highest per capita investments in LNG on the Gulf Coast. We're working with those companies to make sure that they understand that this technology can help be very important in their long-term business plans. So for a state like Louisiana, this is very important. Our governor recently announced probably some of the most exciting news that we've gotten in a number of years is to really focus on resilience and climate. And so for a state like Louisiana, which is a red state, those are exciting announcements. He established a chief resiliency officer that is going to look at these problems long term. And we're going to be, as DNR, involved in those decisions and helping to craft those long-term policies and strategies. So those are very exciting things. And for us, we look at this as something that can really bring everyone together full circle and will be around for a long period of time. So we're going to continue on that momentum. Part of the challenge that we're facing in doing this, obviously that everybody's facing in this room, is that 45Q has been an absolute game changer that has brought so many of the folks here to the table. 2 years ago, we looked at this and started to look at emissions and started to look at long-term strategies. And when we looked at what 45Q could do, the possibilities were real. And what we're trying to do from that is we crafted what is the state's role? What do we do in the process to really make sure that companies and investors who want to come into the state have a very clear path forward on what they want to do and how they want to invest. And so the state's role for us has not been to really go out and point to specific areas to say, go and do a storage project here. Even though we have a tremendous amount of data and we have a regulatory arm that does oil and gas drilling, we want to have private investment come in and look at those individual areas and say, we want to do a project. So the state has focused on pore space. We focused on looking at individual areas. We've tried to help landowners look for resources to identify optimal storage locations. And we've also focused very heavily on permitting. And what we mean by permitting is that if you look at Class 6 permitting in the United States, the story is very clear. There have only been 6 Class 6 permits that have been done throughout the whole of the United States. 2 of those are at ADM in Decatur, Illinois, and the other 4 were for future gens. So those were the only successful Class 6 permits that have been done in the United States in the last several years. So we're looking at time frames that take 5 to 6 years to get a permit approved from EPA in order for a company to come in and do sequestration. With 45Q, the timeline's ticking, and in 2023, we have to have steel in the ground, right? We've heard that today. That's what we're trying to push for. So we're looking at how do we get investments and how do we get secured geological storage to happen in a very compressed time frame while still following through all the environmental regulations and the permitting that needs to happen. Class 6 permitting, carbon dioxide movement in terms of how we do it, the companies that are here today are experts at doing this. Oil and gas companies have been sequestering CO2 for a number of years. They do it very successfully. We're trying to look for ways to help them on the permitting side so they can do it in a more efficient manner. Part of that is our relationship that we have with EPA by trying to get primacy with EPA for Class 6 permitting. We currently have primacy with EPA for Class 2 wells, which is oil and gas drilling wells. Class 6 wells, as I mentioned, are a lot more involved, require a lot more data collection, monitoring, installation costs, capital costs. So that's what we're trying to do right now. We're in the process of becoming hopefully the 3rd state to get primacy. Right now, there's only 1 state in the United States that has primacy for Class 6, and that's North Dakota. The 2nd state to probably get primacy is going to be Wyoming. They're very far along in the process. We're hopefully going to be 3rd when we're working very hard to make sure that that process is done very clearly. Some of the challenges that we look at and when we're trying to go through this process is that EPA are experts in the UIC program, but they also have a staff that works on a lot of different things and wears a lot of different hats. So a lot of them work on primacy, a lot of them work on UIC, and those folks are extremely taxed in terms of the workload that they have already. The other thing is that within the next 2 to 3 years, there will probably be at least 50% retirements in EPA of the experts who are working on the UIC program at the regional and at the headquarters level. So the amount of folks that are working on these very technical, high-level issues involving Class 6 are either leaving the agency or will no longer be there. So we've pushed very hard on the appropriation side by working with our legislators in Senator Whitehouse's office, Senator Cassidy, Senator Barrasso, to really look for opportunities to go to EPA and say, guys, we're going to develop a strategy that can help you from a policy standpoint and an appropriation standpoint to make sure that you have the funding to train new staff, to help us also on the state level to increase staff, so that companies who want to come in have a very clear path forward. So it's imperative that the states are looking at this, that they're focusing on training, and that they're also focusing on their regulatory measures to make sure that they're ready to do this. So we were very fortunate. We had some very forward-thinking legislators in 2009 that passed the Sequestration Act that kind of set the stage for us to come in and for companies to have surety that the state's looking at long-term storage. We've sharpened the pencil on that and done some recent bills. We're working with our pipeline operators to try to make sure that they understand all the different nuances with 45Q. We have the Green Line that runs across the state, which is a 36-inch diameter pipeline that already carries CO2 from Jackson Dome, Mississippi, out to East Texas. So all these things factor in, and I think that what you'll find is as you travel and go to a lot of meetings, a lot of the states have one piece of the puzzle. They'll either have a lot of source material and they won't have pipelines, or they won't have storage. So Louisiana, what we're finding and what we've seen and why it's so exciting is that all 3 pieces to the puzzle are there, including the utilization piece. So we're trying to get companies to think about that, to not only capture carbon, but to utilize it. There's a tremendous amount of work that's being done on that side to turn carbon dioxide into lots of different products and fuels. So we're working with companies to try to identify some of those products and work on some of those solutions. And again, it takes a lot of the conversations that happens in meetings like this, that when you leave and folks who don't normally talk together on the investment side and all these others, we starting to see momentum when we leave these meetings, that people are starting to talk about projects. And until we start to get projects in the states that really start to turn heads, I think that the conversation is going to continue just in terms of going in circles, because for us, right now, getting projects in the ground and getting developers and investments in the state is our number one priority, and we're going to continue to push that. So thanks for having us.
Thank you, Jason. And Jason brought up a lot of different points here, and we're going to try to move quickly through some of them. Both Ryan and Mary, I do want to talk a little bit about security of storage. I think there's a lot of ample evidence on the security of geological storage, but it's certainly something that as we continue to build trust is always going to be kind of an important part of the conversation. And so maybe just some of your comments on demonstrated security of storage, and how do we continue to build this trust and communicate on our history of secure geological storage.
Start because I think you can take over with the EOR comments. So in the carbon storage program, the CarbonSAFE is part of their infrastructure, but they also have this other arm with the R&D for advanced storage, where we're looking at wellbore integrity, monitoring technologies, risk assessment, our NRAP programs underneath that as well. The goal of our program is to eventually have this toolbox where we can just give to an operator and say, this is how you can safely and securely run a storage complex. So there we are doing work on the R&D for proving secure sites as well. But I think that Ryan's probably best to talk. EOR has been doing this for decades now, and in a safe manner, putting CO2 in the ground. So I'll pass it over to you.
You made my point for me. I don't need to say much. No, but really, Julio kind of just hit it before very eloquently, as he does. We've now got a 25-year history of doing dedicated geological sequestration with no issues, no leakage issues. And more than that, we have a 40-year history, Oxy, and also the industry, of doing sequestration through enhanced oil recovery, where we've learned a huge amount about how CO2 flows in the subsurface, how it's trapped. And so we're, the combination of that, we're very confident that this can be done safely. And not only experience, my background was I did my PhD in a research group that did modelling of CO2 storage to look at can it leak, basically. And there's been a huge amount of academic work done on this question, a lot of modelling, and the general summary is, even if you try really hard, drill in a pretty shitty site and have leaky wells everywhere, you still can only leak about 1% over 100 years. So we do have a lot of confidence, but again, finally, we can have that confidence internally, but we need to demonstrate it. We need to be very transparent, and yeah, Jason spoke about, Mary spoke about, R6 wells, do it well, and show it.
Mark, California is probably known as a place where, very liberal, very concerned about the environment, and as such, they've been a leader, but also, particularly aren't maybe open to pipelines, are very concerned about the safety and security of storage. The LCFS protocol has above average, way above average kind of requirements for that when we look around the globe. How is it like working in California with these stakeholders, given some of those challenges?
We have actually done a fair amount of permitting of energy projects in California, and some people just don't want to go to California, and some people ask us whether we're crazy, but we think it makes a lot of sense to be there. We have spent time with various regulatory agencies and seeing good support. I think a state champion coming forward would be great. To date, we've had good receptivity. On the transportation, people bring that up often, and people think automatically pipelines. Well, pipelines could be part of the solution, but there are other forms of transportation that may not be as difficult to permit. Again, for small sources like an ethanol plant, they're already trucking CO2 on the roads. You see that every day. You can continue to do that. Rail is a possibility as well, and even barges, depending on where your locations are. But so far, so good, but it's obviously going to be a challenge. It is the challenge with permitting.
And I'll kind of open it up to anyone else. The infrastructure question is certainly a huge question when we talk about, the hubs and clusters models. And Ryan introduced this in his kind of opening remarks. regarding how that can, hub and clusters are becoming more prominent because it can certainly lower the cost of the storage kind of piece of the equation. What else are we seeing in terms of what we think of kind of opportunities in terms of infrastructure development around the United States that could help these hub and clusters grow more quickly?
Yeah, just a quick comment. I think the United States is very lucky that it actually has 5,000 miles of CO2 pipelines already, and so that's a great head start. And if you kind of map out all the announcements of 45Q projects so far, they fall exactly on that existing network. So that's a great head start. We're very lucky to have that, especially the Gulf Coast is going to be a real hop of that, and that keeps Jason very busy. And the challenge going forward to really meet the type of mid-century scales we need, that's where we're going to need a lot more infrastructure development. But we do have a good head start.
I'll make a comment. So one of the things that we first started looking at with the hub development, because it makes so much sense, is trying to bring the different operators and partners together that, first of all, have CO2 as a source, and then absolutely have looked at different storage areas that they can actually get a pipeline there. So I think that the challenge has been is trying to get everyone thinking in the same line in the sense of how do we get all these folks working together where that hub can grow away from that area. So I mean, the pipelines obviously are critical, and right now the biggest cost that we're starting to see is that even if you have a large source, the issue is that source might not be located very close to a project. So the Decatur project that I referenced earlier works very well because there's not a lot of pipeline costs. I think the storage facility or they're storing 1 million tons per year is actually right underneath where the plant is located. So the challenges that we're starting to work through that we're hearing from industry is to start looking specifically at that. How do we get additional investments? How do we work with the federal government to make sure that infrastructure is given a high degree of priority, that we're continuing to invest in that pipeline infrastructure and can help some of the smaller operators to start looking at these projects? So that's been a big challenge, but I think that what we've tried to do with that, we've hosted several industry days where we've tried to bring together large oil and gas operators with some of the smaller operators that are interested in advancing this type of technology. And I think that hub mentality is obviously very important. For us, we have a steel manufacturer that's using the exact same steel manufacturing process as the steel manufacturer in the Middle East that has a carbon capture project. We're trying to highlight a lot of those different things that we can bring to the table to say, guys, look, this is a complicated subject area, but there are people who are doing it very successfully. And then again, the low carbon market, I think, is going to continue to grow. And I think, again, trying to bring the right folks in the room and bring in the investment community at the local level and continue the outreach and engagement, especially with industry and continuing. And OGCI and Michael have come down, I know more than once, to Louisiana to really kind to foster these conversations. We had a meeting at LSU 2 weeks ago that Global CCS was involved in. And again, what we're starting to see is that companies, again, who I think were on the periphery, are really starting to make positive commitments to say that we want to do a project. And I think that the more that the U.S. focuses on investments and on policy and on infrastructure, the more that you're going to start to see companies that are going to go over the bridge. So some states, I think, are struggling with the sense of, do we further incentivize 45Q? How do we get additional funding towards infrastructure? That's a very hot topic because, again, that's not something that's, I think, an easy ask for when you go to your legislators to say that we specifically need money for CO2 infrastructure. But, again, it's part of the conversation. And I think that, the more outreach events that we have with the right stakeholders, that's going to continue to drive that conversation.
Thanks, Jason. And, Jason talked about kind of these investor days they're doing, the LCU event that the Global CCS Institute participated in with OGCI, and all those things were around kind of educating potential sources about the opportunity to participate. Mark and Ryan, from your perspective, Mark, I know that, for DTE, this has probably been kind of a shorter journey. Oxy probably has a little bit more experience. But one of the themes of this session is the tide is turning, that we're really seeing a lot more momentum and interest from companies who want to store their CO2. Are you feeling that as well in terms of when you're kind of going out and looking for potential customers for your hubs, that there's kind of this accelerating interest?
I think that's true. We've talked to a number of people, and they may say, well, we looked at that 10 years ago. Do we want to look at it again? But often high up in the company, someone's made a commitment. and it's percolating down. And so we're definitely seeing new enthusiasm from people just over the last couple of years where they see, initially they think, oh, you're not really serious, but then they realize we are, and all of a sudden they become serious.
Yeah, I just agree with Mark's points that I have seen that too, that some of the projects that are popping up and you hear about, like, yeah, we looked at that 10 years ago, but now there's a chance, now we can do it. I guess the other general comment is that I'm new to being in the industry here, but it has, I wouldn't say surprised me, but I've been very happy to see just the huge wide range of potential projects that are out there and the diversity of them especially. So yeah, with the value on CO2 on the ground on the table, there's plenty of potential out there.
And we've talked several times about kind of sources and how do you engage them, and obviously one of the sources is just the atmosphere. And so how are you looking at kind of direct air capture projects that could be tied into, other sources, from even a revenue standpoint from LCFS, or potentially revenue from companies like Microsoft who are trying to offset their emissions? How important do you think that's going to be over the next couple of years in terms of commercializing your geological storage?
That's something we've thought about. Obviously, we're not starting there, but as we develop our hubs, we're going to make sure that can we put capture right on top of our space, and then reach out to people. That there's plenty of people out there that are making these commitments, and how are they going to do it? Well, obviously, if you've got a setup where you can basically give them credit for taking CO2 out of the air, that could work well. We're not counting on that for our economics at this point, but that we see that as a natural extension of our project.
Yeah, we have announced the first large-scale direct air capture project. See, the pathway in the near term, at least, that I think we're more likely to see for direct air capture sequestration is paired with EOR. The reason being that the EOR process, you put about as much CO2 in the ground as comes out embodied in the oil. So by pairing with direct air capture, we see a pathway to make carbon neutral oil through that. So that's a really attractive first application at scale of direct air capture. But obviously, what we hope and what we expect is that by deploying that, that's a pathway to get the cost of direct air capture down to the point where we can see more and more direct air capture just for dedicated sequestration.
I'll open it up to questions from the audience, and we may kind of pull back and I have a couple more questions potentially for the panel, but wanted to kind of get you more engaged in the conversation. I see one back there.
I can be loud. Hi, I'm with Utility Dive, and I had a question for Jason specifically just about interest from electric utilities and coal groups and also natural gas groups.
Sure. So regarding utilities, they have been at a lot of our industry meetings. We have two large operators, Entergy, Clico, and some of the smaller co-ops. One is privately owned. They've expressed interest in looking at long-term strategies to start looking at carbon capture, utilization, and storage. Entergy, we've worked very closely with Rick Johnson, who's their resiliency officer. They're extremely engaged in looking at long-term strategies. They have not, I don't think, announced anything specifically on CCUS, but they're looking at a lot of different renewable portfolios that I know I can put you in touch with Rick with. But I mean, they've been involved at almost every meeting. I think that power generation for us, the majority of it comes from natural gas. We generate, I think it's close to 80% of our power with natural gas. So again, for us, that's been the big thing that we're looking at is how to get those power plants interested in doing that. It's definitely something that I think is probably what we consider tier 2. Some of the other methanol production and some of the other things that have a cleaner stream of CO2 obviously are kind of tier 1. But again, power is at the table. I think that they're thinking about it, and we're going to continue to work with them to make sure that they're informed.
And I'll just maybe ask Mary to add to that because, in the projects that we added to our database that are storage projects, there are a bunch of potential sources associated with those. A lot of the sources are power generations, but there's others. So maybe you want to speak to kind of the variety of sources you're seeing on those projects.
Sure, and not only CarbonSAFE, on the capture side, I think we just 12 projects have started to feed studies, and I think Ion alluded to that a little bit earlier, and some are natural gas and some are coal. On the CarbonSAFE, we've seen on phase 2, ammonia generation, ethanol plants, and natural gas plants, and coal-fired power plants, all of them.
Damien, did you have a question?
Yeah, I'm Damien from Sullivan. I had a question on the business model. Because today, 45Q and access to tax credit goes to the owner of the capture equipment. And yet here it's all about storage. So how do you see a business model evolving between the emitter or emitters with storage company? Is it just a service agreement where you charge a fee and get access to CO2, or do you see it more evolving towards developing ventures between emitters and storage and having one CCS company and accessing the tax credit and then remunerating the full chain? What do you see that's
Start with that. It's okay. We've seen a number of things. We've seen everything from one facility that's going to capture and store and take the credit. A lot of the plants need to pass that tax credit along. So they're looking for they need to have an agreement to transfer that along. We've seen someone that's going to own the capture facility. We've seen people that are going to own the pipeline. It's all over the map. There's been a bunch of different unique scenarios that have been proposed over the phase 1s and phase 2s, and we've seen everything. Yeah, just to try to make the economics work.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think there's a variety of potential out there. The two examples I gave is we're working on some of our own project, where it is more of the one co, and then the services arm, the agreement we announced would be more like the services agreement for a fee. But a wider range that will depend on location, industry, and policy. And as you said, like a tax credit might mean a different business structure than CFS, where it's cash credits. There's going to be a variety of things, and it's an interesting thing in how policy evolves, how that will feed back into what business models will actually fit with those policies. It's always a good thing to keep an eye on.
Some of the EOR that we saw, they want to make it economical, make the business case go. They'll use saline as a buffer, so when the EOR fields can't accept it. And then Mattel had worked on the integrated mid-continent project, they call it, where they're going to have it basically pick up from various ethanol sources and pay as you go, like pay to take our CO2 into the pipeline, and then the enhanced oil recovery down the road will pay for that CO2.
Mark, do you have any comments on that?
I think the first step is to identify how big is the pie to share, and then step one in a lot of projects. And once you've got that and people are comfortable with the pies, then you can start parceling it out. That's been our approach. But I think you're right that depending on the circumstances of people's tax appetite and everything, what other participants you have, you're going to have to figure out the best way to share it and make sure all the incentives line up.
Especially on a state-by-state, the incentives are somewhat better.
LCFS, the LCFS is very different than 45Q in terms of who claims and how it works. So you're going to have to structure around it.
Can you talk a little bit about the merchant risk associated with revenue sources like LCFS and cap and trade, and how you can arrange financing surrounding those revenue sources? It seems quite difficult.
I think that's a correct statement. Obviously, the 45Q is solid, and there's a very traditional tax equity market and the structure's there, so that piece is in place. 45Q, essentially CARB worries about it going too high. Most people worry about it going too low, and they've instituted a ceiling but not a floor. And you look at currently it seems to be hanging in there. I do think structures that probably, again, there's three, in my view, there's kind of three pieces. There's the source of the CO2, the host, and then the person that's putting it all together. So you're probably going to need to do a structure that goes up and down, so everybody's going to have to share that risk. But I do think the financing of it, again, traditional like project financing or bank financing, that will be tough. If you're just hoping that there's enough economic pie is big enough that it supports a certain level of debt if you're going to put debt into your project.
It's on balance sheet, corporate.
Yeah, I mean that's certainly our approach, and again, coming from a big company, that's a luxury to have. That we're not starting the first project by doing a project financing, other than the tax equity piece, which probably would be.
Do you have a comment, Jason?
I was going to.
You can.
Yeah. I was going to shift over just a little bit. One of the things that we talked about, and I think that when we start to look at ways to deal with the time frames that we're dealing with, and again, that's been the biggest challenge. So we waited a very long time to get guidance from the IRS, which everybody was patiently waiting for in the last 2 years after 45Q passed. What I touched on earlier was that we really believe that took a lot of time, and that the focus that was on the IRS would shift very clearly to EPA after that happened, and we're starting to see that. And one of the things that I wanted to just mention again with primacy is that when we're working with oil and gas companies and other interested parties who want to do carbon capture, utilization, and storage projects, is that for them, that particular, if the state has primacy or if you have a governmental organization that's looking for ways on the permitting side, that's really what we're hoping is going to drive investment. And what we mean by that is on Class 2 right now, we can have operators come to us and actually work with our individual staff. So we have a staff of about 60 people who are in the Department of Natural Resources who are regulators. I'm not one of them, but they are very good at what they do. And you also have relationships that have been built over a number of years that they have a very clear path forward. They're used to how reviews are done. They're used to the time frames of how those reviews are done. So what we're trying to do in Class 6 that we're hoping is going to drive a lot of just efficiencies related to Class 6 is do the same thing. And so for right now, as I mentioned earlier, there haven't been a lot of projects and a lot of permits that have been done on Class 6. So those six permits, we've looked at them a long time and tried to analyze ways that we can do it more efficiently. As I mentioned earlier, those have taken about 6 years. So for us, that driver in trying to focus resources and staff training and other things has been the number one focus for the state. And again, I see Ryan Opeson from Maryland. Maryland is here as well. I think that we're trying to extend that outreach to make sure that we not only are ready for when people want to come in and do projects, but that the states are informed. So the other thing that I mentioned as well is that there are going to be some bills and some legislative things that I mentioned earlier that are going to happen to try to increase funding for EPA and for the state. So just a little bit on the UIC program. So for the last 20 years, the underground injection and monitoring program at EPA and for the states has been funded at about $10.5 million. That number has not changed in the last 20 years. So we're talking about doing more complex projects, more involved permitting, extensive monitoring, and putting more work and resources on an already thin staff at the state and at the federal level. So there are budgets in place or bills that are in place this session that we're hoping that can increase that. Specifically on the UIC program, we're trying to lobby for somewhere in the neighborhood of about a $6 million increase to that program to try to help facilitate that. Our goal is to try to increase staff, but also to increase knowledge and people to bring in younger staff who can help with these programs. So for us to make these projects successful, we need the resources and we need the people who are reviewing them in order to make that work. So again, I would encourage you to talk to your legislators and talk to the people who are making those decisions to really encourage them to vote and to push for that, because I think for this program to be successful, even though this isn't 45Q specifically, I think that the support system in order to do the permitting on storage is going to be absolutely critical to do that. So I just wanted to mention that before we close.
I'll just follow up with a couple of points on permitting to follow Jason. Certainly, being able to obtain these Class 6 permits in a timely manner is going to be very important to making this work. And there's a lot of capacity building to be done there. But also we're optimistic and hopeful about that, given history with EPA MRV program. So that's where the MRV, monitoring, reporting and verification program, to demonstrate that you've securely stored CO2. Oxy obtained the first EPA MRV plan for sequestration in EOR reservoirs. That took 2 years. That took a while. The second one took 9 months. And then since then, Core Energy, a very small company, I think they're like 20 people, obtained a permit in 3 months. So there was a fast learning curve there at EPA, and we're confident, hopeful that the same thing can happen with Class 6. We have, we all owe a great debt to ADM. They went first. They got those first couple wells done. As Jason said, there's something to look at and learn from. And the imperative is going to be making sure the EPA get the resources they need to be able to do that, which Jason's leadership there has been huge, that I've seen day to day. And imperative also that companies come forward with projects so we can start working this process out and doing it. And again, to hit home again, imperative that everyone does it well, that we're transparent, and that we show everyone we can do this.
I'll just add to that just one other point on EPA, and there's again that spotlight that we talked about shifting from the IRS to EPA. We've been working with staff to try to identify ways to do things, sometimes even in a non-traditional approach. And what I mean by that is that EPA can actually, I mean, right now the regulatory structure obviously you go to each region, and everybody is very familiar with that. And then for Class 6, we see this as something that potentially, if there are only 10 or 15 permits that come in the first year, it would be very difficult for them, if they're scattered across the United States, to be reviewed in one region where you have a very complicated procedure and path forward to review permits. Why can't we take a step back and look at things like a center of excellence? Why can't EPA start to look at identifying specific staff who could potentially review just Class 6 permits to make those efficiencies known? So for the biggest unknown that we're hearing from operators is that they don't want a lot of uncertainty. In other words, they want to be able to get a permit. They want someone to tell them that they can inject, and they want to know very clearly what those timeframes are for reviews, for modeling, and for some of those other things. So we're working very closely with EPA and that staff to try to look for ways and to try to do things almost in a non-traditional approach. And we're hoping that some of those are going to be successful because, again, given the timeframes that we're talking about that we have to do this, we don't have a lot of time. So I think that's going to, again, I think drive investors to look at this and say the regulatory process is critical. If we know what it is and we know when we need to invest and how that process works, I think that we're going to start to see a lot more projects come to storage space. So we're going to keep pushing that.
We probably have time for one more question. Okay.
Ellie Potter, S&P Global. I have a question for Ryan specifically. I wanted to see if you'd be willing to comment on what Jason Klein said earlier when he was talking about the need for a carbon price to make carbon capture more of an industry, I guess. I wanted to see if Occidental had taken a position on that, and if you could kind of explain it if you have.
Occidental doesn't have a public position on carbon pricing. It is something that we're working on internally on developing principles on, but in general, we say that a value on carbon of CO2 on the ground is imperative, and we need that. Carbon pricing is one form. There are many forms. So it's going to be essential to scaling this up.
I think on that note, we will wrap up this conversation. Thank you so much to this panel, not only for participating here, but also the incredible work you're doing to advance CCS. I think you're all kind of models of excellence, hopefully, and you'll kind of show us when we're back here in a year from now or so. Love to see where these projects have moved on over that time. And from this, I think Jeff will come on up, but I think we're going on to lunch.
Great, thank you.